Well, everybody, I am super excited. We are off and running day one, and we are about to have something that, to my knowledge, has never happened in this industry or in the events yet. We've got 50% of the 8 references. We have a representative on this of the Satoshi white paper. So if you have not read Satoshi's white paper, it's a must read. You can Google that and find that anywhere online or at bitcoin.org. And what you'll find in those 9 pages is essentially what really was the catalyst to a couple of decades worth of work, but really was the catalyst to the mainstream awareness of what we now see today with blockchain and decentralized systems and things like that. But there's a backstory that many people don't know. And that backstory is as important as the future story that is going to unfold. And we're super blessed at Inevitable World Summit today to have these 3 gentlemen on. And 2 of those gentlemen, Scott Stornetta and Jacques Quisquater, represent, reference 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the Satoshi white paper, along with several of their peers. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for giving us a chance to hear directly from the horse's mouth, so to speak, how we got here, why it matters, and also where we're going. And then Ruben Merre, who's the CEO and founder of Engrave, is one of the young gentlemen and many young entrepreneurs whose company is standing on the shoulder of these giants. And so as we talk about kind of the legends of cryptography and what we're, all living into, I thought it'd be great to just go around the horn and kind of talk with where we got here. So Scott, we'll start with you, and we'll do kind of like a 60-second to 2-minute intro on, kind of how you got into this space, your lens, and then we'll kind of ask some questions.
Sure. Again, it's a pleasure to be here with new entrepreneurs that we have a lot of hope for, and to share the stage with Jacques. For me, I started outside the crypto space. I was a physicist, but about the last year of my PhD work, I started obsessing about the fact that all the world's data was going to go digital, and that thereafter there'd be no way to really ensure to future generations that the data hadn't been altered. And so it really became an obsession with me about the need to assert integrity and trust into the bits of data themselves, no longer relying on the medium that the data was recorded on, but to find some way to create immutable records. So that was the kickoff for me.
And Ruben, talk to us about your entry into the space and kind of why you started Engrave, but how you solved your own problems with the company.
Yeah, I've always been very passionate about helping people one way or another. And at some point in my life, I realized that I was mostly, let's say, well-versed in finance. And so during my career, I built online courses to help people take control and ownership of their own portfolios, let's say. I also built technology projects that were meant to empower the masses in terms of suddenly getting access to automated wealth management that was only available to let's say, the bigger portfolios. And at some point, I think it was 2017 for me, I came across blockchain, so not necessarily crypto, but more like blockchain. And what really triggered for me to make the full career shift into this space was the idea of having this, for example, let's say a Pakistani father who has his family back home, and he's working in the Arab Emirates, and he wants to send money to his family. And so every month he sends over, let's say, $1,000. And the reality today is that if he wants to do that, it's going to take time, but more importantly, it's going to cost him a lot of money. So it's around 10 to 20% of transaction fees that he has to pay on those remittances. And there are so many more examples of that. And for me, that was really the push, as I could see, like, wow, there is so much potential in this new technology. And well, I not instantly thought about Engrave, of course, but it didn't take long to understand that, let's say, the first layer of making adoption possible, which is security, just like the pyramid of Maslow, wasn't there. And that's why I jumped into that first layer, let's say, of building blockchain and empowering the technology.
And we'll get into more of that later, because I know you had some issues in your early days, and that ultimately were the genesis of you guys creating the current solution that you're selling to the market. Jean-Jacques, how about yourself? 50 years in cryptography. It's been a journey. How did you?
It's a long, it's a long story, but I will say that in few words. My goal was really, for the beginning, to protect people and their information. I beginning that in the 70s, so it's the old stories. At that time, it was not so good, but the whole thing was really the first paper by Diffie-Hellman about how to imagine or to protect by new ways the information of people. I am speaking really about Diffie-Hellman. And I was really, yes, I know I am old, but it was really the trick for me to beginning about it. And I was really happy to do that thanks to my lab. I was working at that time for Philips. Today, I don't think it is always possible to do that. And so reading the paper of Diffie-Hellman, beginning about that, and I was able to have very shortly a group of 7 people. At that time, it was really incredible. And so from the 70s, end of 70s till 90s, we were able to imagine to do everything. It means signature, smart cards, and so on. And indeed, blockchain also.
So,
well,
you know, so there was, so again, back in the 70s, I mean, cryptography was this science that you were on the very forefront of, and, you know, as it emerged in the 90s, Scott, talk to us a little bit about, for those who don't know, I mean, it wasn't called a blockchain when you first started. When you and Stuart Haber were kind of banging out the initial concept of these distributed ledger technologies, of these timestamp systems, like how did it emerge? What was the genesis of what we now know as DLT or blockchain? Because I think, you know, there's no one better to answer it than you. And then the coming together of the cryptographers of the world like Jean-Jacques and you all is kind of how we got here. But talk to us through that lens. What was that like? Why did you solve this problem? Why did it need to be solved?
Well, again, I just want to give credit to those that preceded me. I mean, there was a lot of ferment in the air when I first started thinking about this. And clearly, Diffie-Hellman, Ralph Merkle, the RSA folks, you know, they had done a great deal to motivate the notion that number theoretic approaches, cryptographic approaches, could address a vast variety of newly emerging issues in an all digital world. And I think you also have to picture, it's my last year of my dissertation. My advisor was joint at Stanford, but also at Xerox PARC. And so my office was actually at Xerox PARC. And this was just in the golden afterglow of all the things that were invented in PARC. And so being there at PARC, you felt like you were living sort of 5 or 10 years into the future. And it gave you a chance to anticipate what the emerging issues were going to be. And for me, it came down to, as I mentioned earlier, that the whole society was going to be resting on top of digital records. And those records themselves were highly mutable. And with the separation of the medium from the data, there'd be no way to know whether you were looking at original records anymore. And this really became an obsession for me. I just felt like this problem needs solving, or we won't have a world where we can have trust in all of the systems that we create amongst us as people. We need to solve that problem.
It's so, I mean, I want to draw on that a little bit because I think a lot of the folks, regardless of how new or seasoned they've been in, call it, blockchain, Bitcoin, like the last 12 years, right? Because most people never thought about this stuff, and maybe even until this weekend, some of them. But for the most part, we're about a decade in, but we're not a decade in. We're, 50 years in. And now we're at a point where this problem that you became obsessed about in the late 80s, early 90s, I'm assuming, right? That was the time vector, I'm assuming, is late 80s. I mean, this wasn't something anybody was thinking of. I'm not saying the people you guys were all around, you and Jacques, you guys were thinking about it. Everybody else didn't even know it was a think that they needed to have. Right? Because we were in an analog world. I mean, for the most part, right?
Yeah.
And so
I'm sorry, if I could just jump in on something you just said. It reminds me, I spent part of my time with an advisor in physics that later won the Nobel Prize, and he made the observation as follows. He says, I'm not as smart as those other guys, so I have to anticipate the problems before the smart guys get a hold of them. And I very much had that feeling about this, that I was given this opportunity to start worrying early before the heavyweights could come in and solve this problem. And so that kind of led to the tenacity for me. I also want to be responsive to something you asked earlier that I didn't completely address. And that was, again, we certainly did not call it a blockchain, but our solution was very much a chain of cryptographically linked blocks that built on the trust of every individual user of the system as a peer. And so it goes very much into the philosophy that I've heard Ruben speak very eloquently about the fact that the trust needs to begin and originate with the individual parties. And then we simply need to construct systems that can organize and confederate that trust so that we can carry on all of the social activities that we need to as a civilization.
It's interesting, and Ruben, it's a good segue. So we'll get some of your thoughts on that, and then we'll come around to Jean-Jacques on where the role of confidence is in a second. So trust, Edelman's trust barometer, which is kind of a annual thing that's happened, I think now for over 21 years or 20 years, and they publish kind of the current state and the macro drivers of trust, right? And so this is not something unique to blockchain or DLT or crypto or any of that. It's inherently necessary in a marketplace. You can't have a marketplace without trust. Even the mafia trust each other at some level, or they can't do stuff, right? And so trust is a fundamental thing. And in 2017, Edelman's Trust Barometer had the title of their thing. It was Trust is in Crisis, right? And they graphed like all the countries. And at that time in the Western world, US was leading the way. In other words, we trusted each other less than any other nation, right? And this year, 2020, the report just came out not too long ago, a couple months ago. And this year, the headline was, Trust is Bankrupt. So what you were worried about in the 80s and what cryptographers like Jean-Jacques were worried about in the 80s and 70s has manifest exactly at the time. Now, we could say, oh, is that new? It's not. If you've read books like The Fourth Turning, you understand kind of this happens on 80 to 100-year cycles. But Ruben, you're coming of age in, you really don't know anything other than what Neil Howe and William Strauss and The Fourth Turning would call kind of the crisis period, or the end of the unraveling into the crisis, because you're under 40 years old, right? So basically, you've lived growing up in a world where trust was decaying to the point where now, according to Edelman, it's bankrupt. How has that impacted you and your approach, do you think, if you were to step out of your body for a minute and think about what you're doing and why you're doing it?
Yes. Thank you, Chris. Yes. There are several questions in your remarks. The first, trust, indeed, at the beginning was about the cryptographic algorithms we are using. At that time, first, is trustee, yes. I will not speak long about that, but there was many problems about that because the involvement of NSA and so on. It's not exactly the same story about RSA, but it's not clear at all what is possible to do to attack and so on. Donc, thus, we have a problem with the tools first we are using. Now, suppose that the tools are okay. Now, we want to perpetuate trust, maybe to amplify. I don't know how to do that. At least to transmit it. Well, okay. So I really think that the blockchain is the best tool to do that. I can prove it. I can discuss about that. We don't have time to do that. But it's really true. I mean, well, okay. No, there are many problems with your questions. I mean that we imagine, we suppose that everybody in the scheme are honest, trusted maybe, and correct. And there was really sorry to say that it's not. No.
So I think, so let me repack that and go back to Ruben. So, you know, what you're telling us is that the inputs matter. And I think, you know, again, we don't have time in this to break down all the reasons why blockchain is the best system. But what we do know is we have two gentlemen who probably smarter than on the math side and the cryptography side than anyone else we could have in here. And so we know that we can take your word for it if we can take anyone's word for it. So the inputs matter. The inputs are, you have to have verifiable identity. You got to know who you're dealing with. The other inputs are, you got to know that whatever you're dealing in, whether it's currency, goods, art, whatever, that's actually real, right? And so how do you know that? So that's another input, right? Because the problem with the blockchain, Scott, is potentially the opportunity, right? So it's two sides. It's the immutability of a blockchain, meaning it can't be tampered with without evidence. So it's a tamper evidence storage medium, is my simplest definition for it, with a consensus mechanism. So there's some consensus mechanism that allows us to arrive at whether or not something has been tampered with or not. That's how I explain it to lay people, because it's pretty accurate. And so the inputs matter. And so what Jean-Jacques is saying is that, you know, this notion and this thought of how trust gets made is, can I trust the inputs? If I can trust the inputs, then can those inputs be tampered with? If they can't be tampered with, or I can tell when they've been tampered with, then I can trust the records. If I can trust the records, then I can start to deal with people, companies, institutions, and goods in that marketplace in a more efficient way. So that's my way to, because I cannot speak your language and you're doing a great job speaking ours. That's my way to interpret what you just said. And I'm going to go to Ruben. So Ruben, you've grown up in this world of decaying trust that's now bankrupt. Has that shaped you? How's that shaped you? Were you aware of that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, certainly. So I think if we think about my company right today, Engrave. So where does it come from, and why were we so crazy to build it? And indeed, it comes exactly from the issue of trust. So in 2008, there was an atom bomb, and that exploded, and it exploded right in the middle of the financial system as it existed back then. And that was also a few months later. Suddenly, there was a paper online, the Bitcoin paper, as we all know, and that's what got this new movement going more than it did in the previous years or even decades. And so if we think about that, the reason why we built Engrave is because, well, you have to look at the centralization, which is today the way that trust works. Trust is centralized. And the thing is, we put it to get fully in third parties, like in banks, in governments. So if you would talk about it in the sort of a continuum, you would say on the whole, the full left side of the continuum, you would have the centralized player like banks. And if they would like to move into sort of a decentralized way where there is more power to the people, more power to the individual, then they would be able to do that, but only in very small steps towards the middle of that continuum. So we decided to take the whole other approach. We started from the other side of the spectrum, and we said, how can you do something the most decentralized as possible, which basically means that you fully empower the individual or the node in the blockchain to stand up for itself and vote on whatever it may be, transactions or anything else. And so we realized that if you think about blockchain, even anno 2021, the way that crypto actually works is you have centralized exchanges that own your Bitcoin. And so they have these private keys that grant the full ownership and control of whatever is linked to the address linked to that private key. So exchanges are centralized. Exchanges actually own your crypto. You have a proxy to ask them through a password to the platform, can I do something with my Bitcoin? And they will say yes or no. And at some point in time, they might even do an exit scam, as we've seen many times before, or they will be hacked and their private keys will be stolen by other third parties and they will run away with what is yours. So with Engrave, we asked ourselves the question, okay, if you want to start, so really the first step in that full decentralized story, well, you need to be able to have that empowerment, the first step. And that is you need to own your private key. If you do not own your private key, you're already talking about game over. So we looked at the ways that this worked in the market. We have centralized exchanges, it doesn't work. Then we went to the most secure solutions that exist today, which is hardware wallets and let's say traditional HSMs in the financial industry. And we realized that even there, they didn't create private keys the way they should, which is because they are lacking in two different parts. The first one is they are, and that is something that Jacques also helped us with a lot, is that they are backdoored. Many of them are just backdoored, and that's the way it is. Just look on Google and search, and you will find so many articles just talking about that. So that means that third parties, intelligence agencies, might know already what your key is before you even get started.
Yeah,
the second thing.
I want to interrupt you, but I want to make sure we don't skip over things that we take for granted in the vernacular. Mm-hmm. Backdoor, these things, right? People don't know what these things are necessarily, right? Until they know what they are. So I like how you just started to say what a backdoor is it's a place where other people have access to something that is encrypted, supposedly, right? Is that how you? So just when you say some of these, I might actually pause for a minute and kind of give a more layman's discussion, make sure we don't leave anybody behind. Keep going.
Okay. Yeah, I just don't want to make the monologue too lengthy. But exactly. So backdoors basically mean that there is a third party. They can just hop into the process that's happening to create your key, and they already know the outcome. And so obviously they can steal you even before you have your key. The second thing, and that's something you can see a bit more, it's a bit more present, is that any of these solutions, they just give you a key. They say, this here is your private key. It comes from an offline device, an offline hardware wallet, but it is still an offline thing that it's still a key that they give to you. So in a far-fetched scenario, maybe they might have a database on all the keys they ever made. So again, the very first step of owning what is yours. So we have a tagline at Engrave, we call it start truly owning what is yours. It starts exactly there with you being the only one who sees fully offline setting your key. And at this point in time, it has never been done before. It is impossible. So what we've done is we have taken these chips inside the device and we've said they're really great. They've been perfected over the last decades, but they need external entropy, so external randomness, external, let's say, a part of the key needs to be created externally outside of the chip. So what we've done is we take the chip and then we add the real-time measurements of light surrounding the device, because light is one of the best sources for entropy. And the second thing we do is we actually let your fingerprint become part of your key. So a unique personal part of you becomes part of your key. And the second thing we do is we let you, in a sort of a gamified process, interact with the key. So whatever might have been inside of that chip, it doesn't matter anymore. You have effectively resolved any kind of anti-tampering, any kind of backdoors that might have been in there. And that is how you create a strong private key. And obviously, this was something we also ran by Jean-Jacques in the very beginning when we met him. And this was something he also found very powerful. And I believe it's probably one of the reasons that he bought into our story. Yeah? And for us, it is just the very first step of the way in your full end-to-end customer journey as being a decentralized participant. And it doesn't end with, let's say, writing down your private key on a piece of paper. It ends with you passing away at some point and your family getting access to exactly those private keys that you owned to your Bitcoin, and no third party at any point in time should have access to them. And so if we just go back to that macro perspective, you have the utter left side of the continuum where banks are. They can move a bit more decentralized if they want to. We did the total opposite thing. We started from empowering you as much as possible decentralized, and we will have to, over time, move a bit more into a centralized space, because some people will say, I want to outsource part of my security. I want to have Engrave have a backup of my key if I lose it. And while we start from the full decentralized part of the spectrum, we know that at some point in time, people will need us to, well, give them a nudge, help them somewhere, and be their backup.
So I'm going to unpack a little of that. I mean, you were somewhere in the realm of early teens when the financial crisis of 2008 hit. And I think, again, to contextualize the impacts of those things, when we're young enough where we know stuff is going on around us, whatever that stuff is, right? It shapes our thinking. And so whether that's COVID for kids today, it'll shape how they approach the world. It shapes their fears. It shapes their hopes. It shapes that. When I was coming of age, AIDS was the COVID or the financial crisis. AIDS shaped my generation in ways that only AIDS could, right? Because it was this thing that might kill you. It was dangerous. You didn't know who had it. The point isn't that. The point is that every generation comes through, whether it's the 60s and civil rights and unrest, every generation comes through these things that shape us. And then they become kind of immovable. And so your generation and your DNA was shaped by this knowledge that a multi-100-year institution like Lehman Brothers could go bankrupt. The entire world financial system you put on the brink. And at 12, you don't compute what that means, because most people don't know how the monetary system works in their 30s or 40s, let alone at 12. But what you do know is you're recognizing what's happening to older people around you, your parents, or things. And as a generation, that shapes you, right? And so the good news is that these trust issues are things that are important to your generation, not just you, because you've only known a lack of or a decaying trust and a lack of confidence. Now, Scott, I want to finish with you on this thought. So I'm going to go to Jean-Jacques first, because I know he has a view on confidence, but I also want Jean-Jacques talk about why software and hardware, right? Why that coupling, which is what you saw with Engrave, why that is important in your mind, and give us a minute to 2 minutes on that. And then I'm going to go to Scott, because I want to have you, because you're a philosopher, I want to have you kind of wind this up with kind of where we go from here, how and from your perspective. So Jean-Jacques, confidence, hardware, and software. Talk to us a little bit about that, sir, and why those things are important to you.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Well, I was really thinking about what you are saying. It's really simple. Software is easy to change it, to manipulate it, to manage everything you want or not for the attacker. Hardware is not easy at all to change it. if your hardware is correct, or it is possible to change it at distance. No, it's not possible. So the really difference between software and hardware is the possible ability for the attacker, for the pirate, and so on, to change it. Software, everybody is able to manipulate. Hardware,
Yeah.
not at all.
So just to again, I want to unpack that and move it forward. So that the thing that we've talked about in the green room and things like that before this was your discussion around how software has been eating the world. Mark Andreessen said that years ago in the 90s, I think. But software will eat the world. Well, software will continue to eat the world. Decentralized software. Michael Saylor recently, who's become world famous for putting all his cash reserves on MicroStrategy's balance sheet into Bitcoin, is saying Bitcoin will eat the world, right? And so Bitcoin is software. And so when we talk about software will only continue to eat the world. And yet at the end of the day, we interact through that with some form of hardware, whether it be our PC, our phones, our hard cold wallets, right? Engraved, whatever. And so at some point we have to deal with the cryptography and the security of the interface between the hardware, the case, the box, and the software in it. And so that's an important thing. And, I think that's what endeared you to Ruben and what they were doing and kind of the ways they were thinking about cryptography all the way down to the software, hardware integration. Bless you. So Scott, let's talk about, let's wind this up a little bit with philosophy. I want to give you a minute to vamp, because I've had the pleasure of having the chance to hear you kind of vamp on some of the underlying philosophy that has driven you, but also that you think is important to pass on, not just to the Rubens of the world, but to the me's, to everybody. Let's hear you talk about this and kind of vamp a little bit on where you think we go from here as an industry. What are the warning signs? What are the words of wisdom you'd like to impart with this generation, so that as they build these things and the cement's still wet, they can do it with the wisdom that you've seen over the last 40 years?
Well, I don't know how much wisdom there is, but I'm going to make a run at it here. I guess the thing I would say is we really like the Rubens of the world. And let me tell you what I mean by that. It's nothing personal, Ruben. Don't necessarily like you as a person. Let me tell you why I like people like you. And that is, I do have this historical perspective, but understand that we also are active investors in this space, and we have to make go, no-go decisions about who we back. And one of the characteristics that we like so much are people like Ruben, who tie their ideals into a pragmatic solution. And I love so much what Ruben is talking about when he talks about you have to start with your own ownership or identity. And, to me, this harkens all the way back to the Declaration of Independence, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. I'm the starting point, my identity, who I am. And Ruben is simply saying that we've all in the past ceded some of our identity, some of our authority into institutions because of efficiency's sake. And now we have the chance to reboot that. That's your fourth turning point. We have the chance to go back to our original ownership of our own unalienable rights and rebuild the structures that we want to execute on our behalf. Another phrase that he used that I think really goes to the heart of this is peer-to-peer, okay? In a sense, you talked before about how the blockchain is just a tamper-evident cryptology, but when it is distributed in a peer-to-peer fashion, where peer-to-peer consensus is formed, that's what turns tamper evident into immutable. And, you know, Satoshi was shooting for peer-to-peer with Bitcoin. And yet, I mean, it's in the title. And yet, as it has played out, it really isn't peer-to-peer. And so we want to drive to that fundamental that Ruben is talking about, where each of us is a first-class citizen, if you will. And I'm melding there the computer science sense of a first-class citizen with what it means to be a citizen in the world. We want to empower certain constructs to exercise our individual autonomy. And Ruben is rebooting from the ground up. And that's just a wonderful, you know, it's just a wonderful feeling. So I think I've said enough there.
Yeah, I couldn't say it any better. And having it come from you matters because it kind of organically came out. I mean, the point of all this that we're curated, the point of SDK, the point of, you know, Ngrave, the point of IOHK's efforts with Cardano and Atala and all this stuff is this notion of self-sovereign identity as the starting point. Self-sovereign identity of allowing a marketplace, a two-sided marketplace, whatever that may be, whatever that may include, to have self-sovereign actors on both sides that can be verifiable more efficiently, that can trust because the digital trust layer has been solved for them. And the issuance of that sovereign ID can then be the ultimate delegator of the edge network IDs that they participate in. And that's the unique possibilities of the future. So I think, you know, you just nailed it on the head. I think why we're all here this weekend.
If I could take one more lick on the hardware versus software issue.
Please, yes, please.
I didn't really support what Jacques was going to. If you think software is eating the world, and I credit A16Z, okay, just try doing it without hardware, okay? It's computation that is eating the world. It is computation that is gaining the ability to mediate all interaction from people to people. And when I think about software without hardware, I just think of this poor guy that, and I can't remember who it was, but about 500 years ago, was calculating pi by hand out to a few hundred digits. Took him a couple of decades. And only later did he realize that he'd made a mistake about 150 digits in. So if you like software, just imagine it without hardware. Software and hardware have to be, you know,
I mean, Ruben, you know, your tagline of own what's truly yours is something I've always resonated with. You know, our overarching kind of thing, Scott, speaks right to that, which is that does your hardware own you or do you own it? And it makes people think because they go, well, wait, I bought it. And buying it and being able to resell it on eBay and make money back or trade it in and get some credit for it, that's not ownership. When we're talking about computation, when we're talking about data and data exhaust, what we're talking about is, does it own you or do you own it? Is who is the owner of that encryption? Who is the one who has the say of when and where and how it gets decrypted and delegated by who, and who can pull that consent back? And if those answers are not you don't own it, it owns you. And so this movement that we're all on and that the Ngraves of the world are part of helping to enable at scale is this notion of you can't do it without hardware. And when you do it with hardware, whatever it may be, own it. And I think we're going to end there. And guys, I can't thank you enough. Jean-Jacques, Scott, Ruben, thanks so much for being there. It was amazing.
Chris?
It's going to be.
I had one more philosophical thing to add, and or maybe two. The first thing is very short. I just wanted to say that we actually found that so compelling what you mentioned about do I own the hardware or does the hardware own me? So we added in a sentence, so the zero talks to you, the hardware wallet, the moment you turn it on and it tells you, hello, very simple, hello, I'm zero. From now on, I will protect your assets.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And from that moment on, it's all you. And the second thing I wanted to say, because it started to resonate with me while we were talking about it, is actually that trust is the most important currency of them all, and that's just what blockchain is all about. And I read a book. It's called The Culture Code, and it talks about a very, very interesting experiment. What it does is it puts it against each other, MBA students and toddlers. And they have the same exercise. They have to build the highest possible tower they can with 20 spaghetti sticks, a marshmallow, a yard of rope, and a yard of tape. And on hundreds and hundreds of groups, the average winner is by far the toddlers. And so that obviously you start thinking, why is that the case? And so if you look from afar, you see that these MBA students, they start to strategize, they start to think about plans, and the toddlers they just go in, right? They just start doing whatever they're doing. And what actually is happening underneath the surface, it's that the MBA students, they are in a sort of an unclear, unconscious way of testing who is the leader, what is my position in the group. Like all of these interactions are going on that are based on the trust issue. Whereas with the toddlers, they just go, and one starts doing something, another one of them, he just says like, maybe you can do this, and they're just like in a full 100% zone of trust. Everybody can do what they want, and they're just helping each other out. And they did the exercise again with CEOs, and every time the toddlers win. And the book goes on talking about how the Navy SEALs, who are, let's say, the most trusting people towards each other in the world, and they are extremely effective in what they do, but also, let's say, NBA players who are winning the playoffs, they all are basing the way they interact on the exact same principles that those toddlers are using right there and then. And it's let's say, so the youngest people among us are actually the ones who can teach us the most about trust. And that's just something I wanted to add to the conversation.
It's a beautiful way to wind it up, because if these two gentlemen who we are honoring today with their continued commitment, and also their contributions to this point that have laid the foundations for all the rest of us, if there's one thing that it's done, is it's made us all new again. The playing field has been level. And so when we're new again, we can re-embody the spirit of a toddler. We can be improvisational, where the answer is always yes and, right? Not yes, but. And so I think I encourage people to read that book. Guys, thanks for being here. We're going to go on to the next talk. This was awesome. And I can't wait to see where we all are a year from now. Thanks, guys. Thanks for being here.